So, I don't know if you guys have seen yet. It's been all over the place, you probably have, but about 2 days ago, there was a recall election in a school board in San Francisco, of all places. And there's some good takeaways from this, which I want to get into, but just generally, I think it showed that parents are getting tired of the internal dynamics of one of America's most progressive cities. And I think it shows maybe a playbook for how some Democrats could run in the midterms, even though we're kind of already into that. But this links in some ways back to an article I remember reading in August, which I want to just talk about real quick before we get into this news story. But in August, The Economist had an article called Why San Francisco's City Government is So Dysfunctional. And it makes a good point. It mentions how one City Hall insider suggests that San Francisco overreacts to issues that are in the national news and kind of designs solution to the country's problems rather than their own. And because of the high density of wealth, a lot of students were in private schools or charter schools. It basically talks about how a lot of San Francisco's more wealthy population is kind of insulated from the country's problems. And so that's in a way why they sort of focused on these identity politics issues, these progressive causes, these identitarian issues, while the city's kind of not doing too hot. I mean, I haven't been actually since the pandemic, but I mean, you just hear about the homeless crisis is getting worse. Crime is up, shoplifting, all that type of stuff. And I've talked to friends who live there or have gone there, and I think, I mean, if you like San Francisco, you like San Francisco. But I think for a lot of moderates, probably not the place I would want to go. And I think it's just because, like this article points out, the city overreacts to issues that are really national instead of focusing on their internal issues. And I just wanted to add that for context. But anyways, on Tuesday, so not 2 days ago, but a little bit longer, voters did recall 3 members of the San Francisco School Board. I don't know if you guys remember, but over the summer, the board was criticized because, I mean, kids were barely going to school during the pandemic. And there were board members that were spending their time renaming schools and trying to implement other progressive agendas. I always think of this example when people say that critical race theory doesn't exist at all in lower education. It does. It's not this radical threat that conservatives think it is. It's not, forcing kids to like change their gender or talk about, fluidity or only focus on race. But it has obstructed, I think, kids getting back into school during the pandemic, and it's obstructed kind of the dynamics of just giving kids a quality education, in my opinion. And it seems less about teaching our true history and more about how to be an anti-racist. And that's kind of where this San Francisco issue is happening right now, because I mean, it's sort of ironic. Like, these people over the summer were, renaming schools named after Abe Lincoln, Paul Revere, because I guess they thought Paul Revere had tried to annihilate this Native American tribe, which actually wasn't true, but they just assumed he did. There's just lots of stuff. Like, there was this mural of George Washington that they wanted to get rid of because, yeah, it was a little insensitive to our modern context. Like, it was him fighting Native Americans, I believe. And they were going to get it taken down, which, okay, if the voters want it, go for it. But I guess they forgot to file some environmental impact forms or something, and so they couldn't get it done. So it was just kind of this chaos, lackluster attempt to reform the city and cancel some people that probably didn't need to be taken off schools. But anyways, Politico has a good article about what happened here. So there's an article from Wednesday that says, in quotes here, San Francisco voters have recalled 3 school board members who spurred a parental backlash for pursuing the renaming of schools and other progressive policy changes as classrooms remained empty during the coronavirus pandemic. Voters overwhelmingly voted yes to recall Allison Collins, Gabriela Lopez, and Fauja Moliga, 3 of the school's 7 members. 79% voted to remove Collins, 75% voted to remove Lopez, and 73% voted to remove Moliga. End quotes. And like I've already kind of mentioned, to add context here, I mean, San Francisco was one of the cities that barely put kids back into schools for the first year of the pandemic. Now, if you could afford to, a lot of people had their kids in charter schools, which that Economist article talked about. But it was the public schools, which are usually the kids that actually need the help. Public schools are important for daycare, for giving kids protection, for giving kids food, for helping them do something other than just stay home, and they were all closed. And instead, The school board members, like I mentioned, were just doing their best to rename, I think like 40 schools, including Abraham Lincoln High School. Even Dianne Feinstein was one because apparently she defended someone's right to fly a Confederate flag in the 80s. The board members also pushed to end merit-based admissions at this prestigious Lowell High School. And to make it even worse, one of the board members who got recalled, I think it was the Collins one, she sued the district after she was penalized for an old tweet which accused Asian Americans of using white supremacist thinking to get ahead. This is like just the textbook definition to me of just kind of radical, toxic progressivism here, and I really think these people are nuts. I'm sorry, but they are. Like, okay, so she accuses Asian Americans of using white supremacist thinking to get ahead, and then obviously she's penalized, and then so she sues them over it? No, I mean, I think that's a ridiculous statement. Changing Abe Lincoln's name because he isn't perfect in our modern context is insane to me. Yeah, I've read things that he was not as perfect of a fighter against slavery as people think. Like, obviously, he was the one who helped emancipate slaves, so he's crucial. But I think some of his personal views were probably more aligned with the time. But does that mean we should take him off everything? No, he was a crucial guy in American history. This shit is exactly why Republicans are weaponizing critical race theory. This is exactly why Glenn Younkin, of all people, got elected in Virginia. I have friends who still tell me that wokeism doesn't exist, that there really isn't this crazy wing of the Democratic Party. But I'm sorry, it's there. It's definitely there. I just think it really takes some arrogance and delusion, I guess, to think that reducing merit-based admissions, changing the names of high schools, and even attacking Asian Americans as being complacent to white supremacy is the best way to run a school district. Like, let's be honest. Especially while kids are far behind, losing social skills, there's younger kids who are in this super important developmental phase are losing crucial periods of their time. It's just ridiculous to me. And early on, okay, it made sense to close schools. No one knew what was happening. I was teaching in Spain, during the first 4 months of the pandemic, and we went remote then. They locked down way harder than the U.S., which makes sense. It was so bad that I couldn't leave the house, as I'm sure I've talked about, unless it was to get groceries. But as I recall, by June, we locked down in March. By June, even Spain had kids going back to school. They just had half the class go one day, the other half go the next day. And honestly, it was probably better because the kids had more attention and more small groups to learn. But yeah, I'm just kind of surprised that a very liberal, progressive city, probably one of the most progressive in the United States, actually voted to recall these people. I think that's really telling. And David French has a really good piece in The Atlantic, I think from yesterday, that kind of talks about the bigger implications of this, which right now in our polarized, kind of radicalized political climate, I think it's important to discuss. He talks about how this is a huge symbolic victory of reason over radical ideology. He discusses in quotes, it provided an example not of how the right can beat the left, but rather of how the left can regulate and reform the left. An example that can be emulated on the right, which is a whole other thing. I don't know if the right's ready for that, but he goes on to discuss something that I think is really important. He mentions how parents that were concerned about the school district endured an extraordinary backlash, right? Obviously, some parents want their kids back in school, and when they see on the news that these board members are focused on renaming schools, yeah, it's going to piss you off, especially if your tax dollars are going towards this. But apparently some of the parents who spoke out about this were called racist. They were doxxed, the public exposure of private information. And they were just bombarded with accusations of white mommying. It's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. But French links this to a bigger issue in our culture in which those who aren't willing to conform to the radicals are intimidated or called weak. And we see this on both sides. All the death threats that the Republicans who voted to impeach Trump got, the Republicans that voted with Biden's infrastructure bill, the death threats. It's very mob-like and very authoritarian in a lot of ways, both sides, I would say. And I know it's cliche to say both sides, but there is this kind of intimidation strategy by radicals to get the moderates to conform. And there's a growing amount of attacks, which French talks about in this, on just reasonable dissent, that wants to challenge radical views. And he discusses, so there's this study called Hidden Tribes. And it's a project that basically argues, in quotes here, that American political culture is way far more nuanced than just red-blue binary or left-right binary, right? French discusses how the study found that America is populated by a number of groups that defy these neat red-blue distinctions. He says these different groups run from progressive on the far left to devoted conservatives on the far right. But these wings, as he says, only represent about 14% of the population. Yet they dominate discourse. And he's like, there's an exhausted majority, and I would probably call myself part of that exhausted majority. I'm kind of center right, kind of center left on some stuff. But the extremes are just pushing me towards being politically homeless, I guess, which sometimes I wish I named this podcast. But anyways, this is just interesting to me, though, because French does a good job of positing that it is kind of this moderate majority that can bring America back from the brink, if you want to put it that way. He gives some examples of Biden's victory in some ways, Eric Adams in New York City, and even the 2021 Southern Baptist Convention, which brought in a leader known for racial reconciliation instead of radical fundamentalism and right-wing ideology. And, the radical wings are kind of speaking for everyone right now in the country. And I think that's why San Francisco was important, because I think especially, outlets like Fox News make it sound like everyone in San Francisco is just granola and super progressive and defund the police. But I think a lot of people aren't that crazy. I mean, I grew up in Tahoe, and I knew a lot of people from San Francisco, and I don't think most people are actually that radically liberal. I think you just have this small group who usually likes to go into power. That's the same on the right. They're the ones that are running for the school boards, right? And I think a lot of people are sick of it, and so it's a good thing to see. I talked about this on Wednesday, but I think this is why a lot of working class Americans and Canadians, I guess I was talking about on Wednesday, but I think that's why they've turned their back on the Democratic Party, and they're getting kind of almost radicalized, because during a once-in-a-generation pandemic, Democrats in big cities and national Democrats also, they focused on identitarian politics and kind of not the economic stability and safety of people who needed it. And I'm not saying economics is everything, but during a pandemic, I think people want to be taken care of, or at least feel like they're being listened to. And these leaders neglected getting kids back into schools and put that icing on the cake. And it's really tough to have a happy populace, And French's piece is really good. It's in The Atlantic. I recommend people check it out. I was also listening to the Russian chess superstar, Garry Kasparov. He's a big critic of Russia, the Kremlin, Putin, the Soviet era as well. And on the podcast, he kind of had a great point about progressivism needing to calm down on its loathing of the American ideal. He mentions that, of course, the U.S. needs to do some form of a self-analysis of our problems, and we need to get closer to equity for all. We need to learn our true history, which, of course, Republicans are trying to stop. We literally have canceling of books on the right as well. So believe me, I'm not saying that the right is good on this. But he said the left seems to have an issue of always condemning America's bad, America sucks, I wish I was somewhere else, like it's such a racist, evil country. And he says this over time builds up to a point where it feeds a narrative for autocrats like Putin or Xi Jinping or Viktor Orban. They can say, see, the Americans say their system is awful and racist. Democracies don't work. So why have one? And I think it's a good point, because the world is really watching us right now for so many reasons. And there's a busy day on my street down there. But I think it's a good point, because the U.S. has been a beacon of hope, a flawed beacon of hope at times. But these illiberal countries are watching us, and it's giving them an excuse to push forward their alternative model. And so I think we need to reform America, learn about our history, and work together on that. But hating America and loathing America and just saying everything is racist, it just feeds the other narrative, and we don't want to do that. And also, real quick, sticking to California for a moment, the state is interesting in general. I'm fascinated with some other polling that I've seen, because, okay, the recall was one thing. Makes complete sense to me. I think Democrats are starting to wake up, or at least the more moderates. I mean, like I mentioned, 2 weeks ago, some states are, ending the indoor mask mandates. Now, Chicago's not. I was wrong, unfortunately, about that. Illinois on February 28th is, but of course Chicago's their own deal, so they actually are not doing that. But I think generally Democrats are starting to wake up to some of the political problems of these kind of baseless COVID restrictions at this point. But anyways, on California, apparently some big name Democrats are also underwater. Politico reported yesterday that both Dianne Feinstein and Kamala Harris are underwater in a new California poll. And the poll is from the Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. I'm assuming that is not a right-wing poll, just making a guess. And the voters disapproved of Feinstein's job performance by a 19-point margin. That one makes sense to me. I think a lot like Barbara Boxer, who's retired now, a lot of people are kind of sick of these career politicians like Nancy Pelosi as well. Feinstein is so old. I'm sorry, not to be ageist, but I think it's time for some new blood, and I think a lot of the younger generation feel the same, But Vice President Kamala Harris also fared very poorly in this recent poll. More voters, according to Politico, disapproved of her job performance at 46% than approved at 38%. And that's a huge problem for her because obviously her ascension was a point of pride in California. I remember when she, became the vice president and was sworn in. I remember a lot of people I knew in California were just jumping for joy and celebrating and yada, yada, yada. But it's a really bad look. And I'm sure it's related to the whole country's affairs. But, it's her home state. It's a Democratic state. She's a Democratic vice president. She was the senator, DA. Not a good look. And I also saw that Biden is also not polling very well. And the reason why I mention this is because I'm hesitantly optimistic that California may be changing. Maybe it was a reflection point during the pandemic. I don't think it's going to become some right-wing state, obviously. We saw that Larry Elder did not do well against Gavin Newsom in that recall, back in September, I think it was. But the fact that there was a recall and that all these polls are showing that, one of our senators, the vice president, are not as popular as we would imagine. They're actually unpopular, technically. It tells me that maybe the state is getting some common sense, which I think is good. During the Carter presidency, when it was really struggling, we saw movements come out of California, like Reagan, for example. And I don't think California is going to go red, but maybe it's moderating. I think COVID, again, not to bring this home too many times, but COVID really did bring the mask off of inequality in the state. And there were the hypocritical lockdowns, where Gavin Newsom and Nancy Pelosi would dine out or get their haircuts without masks while the rest of us had to wear them, while local businesses were closed, but they kept giant stores open, kids stayed out of school. I think people are starting to wise up, so it should be interesting.